Elena was alone in her cozy apartment that evening, the soft hum of the city outside her window mixing with the quiet ticking of her clock, and she had been lost in thought, sipping warm tea and letting the steam curl around her face like a gentle caress, feeling the comfort of solitude settle around her, when a sudden firm knock at the door made her heart skip a beat, a sound so ordinary yet striking enough to startle her and pull her from the calm rhythm of her evening, and for a moment she hesitated, her hand frozen in the air with the teacup, wondering who could possibly be visiting at this hour, because she rarely had guests, and the neighbors were usually reserved and polite but distant, never crossing thresholds unless necessary, so the knock felt unusual, unexpected, and for reasons she couldn't immediately name, a little exciting, as if the universe had decided to interrupt her quiet night with something unpredictable, something that might shake the stillness in her chest, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the door, feeling a flutter in her stomach she couldn't quite explain, her footsteps light on the wooden floor, the soft patter almost echoing like a heartbeat of its own, and she peered through the peephole, expecting perhaps a delivery person, or maybe one of her neighbors she had nodded to in passing but rarely spoken with, and her eyes immediately widened when she recognized the face staring back at her, a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in years, someone who had been a part of her past in ways she hadn't realized she still remembered, and the shock of recognition made her pause, holding the peephole with a firm hand, a mix of surprise, curiosity, and something else that stirred deep inside her, something delicate and tentative, because it was Adrian, her neighbor's brother, a young man whose presence had once brought casual smiles and fleeting conversation during summers past, someone she had only met briefly when their families had shared weekend barbecues and casual gatherings, someone whose laugh she had remembered, whose eyes had seemed to hold a kind of warmth and humor she rarely saw, and seeing him now standing just outside her door, made her heart pound in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying, as if the quiet of her life had been punctuated with a spark that might either illuminate something beautiful or burn too quickly and vanish. She straightened herself, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement, and opened the door slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter the delicate tension that hung in the air, and when the door finally swung open, Adrian was there, a small package in his hands, his posture slightly awkward, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes, which carried a hint of shyness or hesitation, maybe both, and Elena's breath caught in her throat, because seeing him again, after all these years, felt like stepping into a memory that had waited patiently for her to arrive, and for a moment neither of them spoke, their eyes locking in a way that stretched time, the quiet stretching between them like a fragile thread that could either break or weave a connection anew. He shifted slightly, the package cradled carefully in his hands, and she couldn't help noticing how much he had changed, how his presence now seemed more solid, more confident, yet still carrying the gentleness she remembered, the same warmth that had lingered in her memory and now seemed to radiate in the space between them, making her pulse quicken and her mind whirl with thoughts she hadn't anticipated, thoughts of summers past, laughter shared, fleeting conversations, and the sense of something unspoken that had existed between them back then, perhaps unnoticed, perhaps ignored, but now impossible to deny. "Hi, Elena," he said softly, his voice carrying a familiarity that tugged at her heart, and it was strange to hear her name spoken with such ease, as if the years hadn't passed, as if time had folded neatly to bring them to this very moment, on this ordinary doorstep that suddenly felt extraordinary, charged with potential and unspoken emotion, a place where simple politeness and casual greetings could transform into something more, something tender and meaningful, and Elena felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear, not knowing what to expect, not knowing whether this encounter would be fleeting or transformative, but sensing deep down that it mattered, more than she had realized it could. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter, her hand brushing the door frame almost shyly, and Adrian's eyes flickered with a quiet relief, a subtle appreciation for her invitation, and he stepped across the threshold into her apartment, the small package in his hands acting as a bridge between past familiarity and present connection, something tangible in an evening filled with intangible tension and longing. The air in the room seemed to shift, the usual quiet replaced by an undercurrent of emotion neither of them had anticipated, a soft electricity that made even the hum of the city outside feel distant, insignificant, and inconsequential compared to the sudden closeness of a man she had barely thought about for years and now could not ignore. They moved toward the living room, their steps careful, hesitant, And yet there was a rhythm, a natural flow, a subtle acknowledgement of the connection that existed silently between them, and Elena couldn't help but notice the small details, the way he tucked a strand of hair behind his ear, the slight curve of his smile, the warmth in his eyes that seemed to reflect memories she hadn't realized she still carried, the way his presence made the apartment feel fuller, richer, charged with meaning. She hadn't expected to find in such an ordinary evening. As they settled across from each other, the air seemed to hum with possibility, the kind of quiet tension that makes hearts race and minds wander, imagining futures that had not yet been written, revisiting pasts that felt like a soft echo in the corners of the room, and Elena found herself laughing nervously at something Adrian said, a small joke that reminded her of simpler days, and he laughed too, the sound low and familiar, and in that moment the years melted away, leaving only the shared warmth, the subtle attraction, the gentle thrill of rediscovery, a spark that neither had expected but both could feel, delicate, fragile, yet undeniable, and the package he held sat between them almost like a symbol, small and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of connection, of past and present intertwining, of something new beginning quietly, softly, without fanfare. And Elena realized with a quiet shock that a simple knock at the door had altered the rhythm of her evening, that her ordinary night had become a turning point, that a doorstep moment, so small, so fleeting, had opened a window to emotions she had long kept locked away, emotions of longing, curiosity, attraction, and the tender ache of rediscovery. And as they continued to talk, sharing stories of the years apart, laughing at misadventures, and speaking in tones that blended nostalgia with newfound connection, Elena felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of possibility she hadn't dared to acknowledge before, and when Adrian finally looked at her with a smile that carried quiet hope, she realized that this moment, this evening, this simple meeting, could be the start of something neither of them had seen coming, something emotional, romantic, and profound, a gentle unfolding of hearts, an awakening of feelings, a promise wrapped not in grand gestures but in quiet presence, in shared glances, in the electricity of a doorstep encounter that would linger long after the door closed, leaving Elena's heart full of anticipation, curiosity, and a soft, undeniable longing for the next chapter of their story. Adrian and Elena sat across from each other in her cozy living room, the small package that had brought him there now resting on the coffee table between them. Forgotten as their conversation deepened, the initial awkwardness slowly melting into an easy, natural rhythm as they laughed over old memories, shared small confessions, and discovered new details about each other that neither had expected to find, the sound of their voices blending with the soft hum of the city outside, the distant cars and muted chatter serving as a backdrop to a moment that felt suspended in time. And Elena felt a strange thrill run through her as she noticed the changes in Adrian, the way his shoulders carried confidence, the warmth in his smile, the quiet strength in his hands, and yet beneath that exterior was a vulnerability, a tenderness that drew her in, made her heart flutter, made her notice how he listened, truly listened, as if every word she spoke mattered, as if her thoughts and feelings had a weight he had been waiting to understand, and in response, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't anticipated, speaking of fears, of loneliness, of small regrets and big dreams, and he responded with care, his voice gentle but steady, offering empathy and insight without judgment, the kind of attention that made her feel seen, really seen, after so many years of living quietly, cautiously, emotionally guarded. And as the minutes turned to hours, Elena realized that the evening was no longer just a casual reunion, it was becoming something more, something delicate and profound, a shared intimacy that neither had planned, yet both were drawn to, a magnetic pull that seemed to exist beyond words, beyond logic, existing purely in the space between them, in the glances, the soft laughter, the gentle pauses that carried weight, and she found herself stealing small looks at him, noticing the way his eyes lit up when he spoke, the subtle quirks in his expressions, the slight tilt of his head when he was thinking, the way his presence seemed to fill the room in a comforting yet electrifying way, and she realized with a shock that she had been imagining this moment for years, replaying it in her mind in fragments she hadn't fully acknowledged, and now it was real, tangible, unfolding in front of her, unpredictable, thrilling, emotionally charged, and Adrian seemed to sense it too, his smile lingering, his gestures careful but inviting, as if he wanted to close the distance without rushing, as if he too was navigating the delicate dance of rediscovery, of reconnecting hearts that had once brushed past each other without truly colliding. And Elena felt a rush of warmth, of longing, a mixture of excitement and fear, because the connection they were forming was intense yet fragile, beautiful yet uncertain, and it required courage to explore, to acknowledge, to speak aloud what their hearts were already hinting at. Yet neither of them dared rush, both savoring the quiet tension that made every word, every glance, every laugh feel significant, feel alive. She noticed how Adrian's hands moved as he spoke, expressive, deliberate, gentle, and it reminded her of afternoons long ago, when gestures had meant something subtle but unforgettable, and now each motion carried a new weight, a new meaning, a promise wrapped in simplicity. And as they shared stories of travels, of friends, of missteps and achievements, Elena found herself drawn into a space where the past and present mingled seamlessly, a narrative of life interrupted by absence and then, beautifully resumed, the kind of emotional reconnection that makes hearts beat faster, makes breaths shallow, and makes the world outside fade into insignificance because everything that mattered was right there, in the small apartment, in the soft glow of the lamps, in the quiet intimacy that was growing between them, a fragile thread yet strong enough to tug at the core of her being. And as Adrian laughed at an embarrassing memory they both shared, she noticed how his eyes softened in a way that spoke volumes without words, a gentle confession of feelings he hadn't dared articulate, and Elena's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and fear, because she, too, felt that pull, that quiet longing, that undeniable attraction that had been simmering under layers of time and distance, and it was suddenly impossible to ignore. Time seemed irrelevant as they talked about things they had never spoken of before, vulnerabilities they had kept hidden, desires they had only whispered in private thoughts, and with every sentence, with every shared silence, Elena felt the walls around her heart crumble slightly, allowing a warmth, a tenderness, a romantic ache to seep in, a kind of emotional awakening that was both thrilling and terrifying, because it meant she was allowing herself to care deeply, to hope, to imagine a future that might include him. And Adrian seemed to mirror her sentiments, the way he leaned in when she spoke, the way he asked questions not for courtesy but for genuine understanding, the way his expressions betrayed the emotions he was trying to keep composed, subtle hints of nervousness, excitement, admiration, and perhaps even longing that made her pulse race, and she realized that this was no ordinary encounter, that a simple doorstep visit had evolved into a profound emotional moment that neither of them could have predicted, yet both had been silently yearning for, a chance to reconnect, to rediscover, to feel, to remember what it was like to be seen by someone who mattered, someone who once held a small place in their life and now was claiming a much bigger one, quietly, gently, without force but unmistakably. Just as Elena felt ready to voice the flood of emotions threatening to spill from her, to acknowledge the attraction, the longing, the connection that had grown between them in mere hours, a sudden ringtone broke the delicate bubble, a harsh reminder of the world beyond the apartment walls, a phone call that pulled Adrian momentarily away, a sharp contrast to the intimacy they had built, and as he answered, Elena watched him, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the fleeting glance toward her that carried a question, a hesitation, a subtle fear that this moment, this fragile, beautiful moment might be interrupted, might be fleeting, and her heart ached with the possibility, the uncertainty of whether the connection they were forming would survive beyond this evening, beyond the ordinary chaos of life. But even as he spoke, she could feel the undercurrent of emotion that had not left, the pull that lingered, the unspoken understanding that they had stumbled into something rare, delicate, profound, a shared emotional space that demanded attention, respect, and care, and she realized with quiet awe that she was not afraid of the intensity, of the vulnerability, because it was mutual, because in his presence, she felt safe, seen, cherished, even if the words were not yet spoken aloud, even if the future was unclear, even if the world outside waited to intrude. The conversation resumed, quieter now, tender, almost hesitant, but charged with unspoken meaning, as if each sentence, each laugh, each pause was an unspoken promise, a careful negotiation of hearts that had once been strangers and now were slowly, deliberately, becoming companions in this fragile, beautiful moment. And Elena found herself daring to imagine the possibilities, daring to hope that a simple knock, a casual doorstep visit, could blossom into something enduring, something romantic, something that might fill the spaces in her life she hadn't known were empty. And as Adrian finally hung up the phone, returning his full attention to her, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten, a mixture of longing, reassurance, and tentative courage reflected in his gaze, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that this evening, this simple conversation was only the beginning, A soft yet irrevocable turning point in both their lives. A gentle awakening. Of hearts, a romantic tension poised between vulnerability and desire, excitement and caution, hope and fear. And as they leaned back, sipping tea that had long since gone cold, laughing at small jokes, sharing glances that lingered too long, Elena felt the thrilling ache of possibility, the emotional pull of attraction that was no longer just a memory, but a living, breathing reality between them, a connection that would linger, grow, and evolve if nurtured. And even as the night deepened and the city outside grew quieter, she sensed that the spark that had been lit would not easily fade, that their hearts had begun a slow, deliberate dance, an intimate, emotional rhythm that would guide them through the coming days, weeks, and perhaps even years. And with a gentle sigh, a racing heart, and a mind full of dreams and questions, Elena realized that the simple act of opening her door to Adrian had unlocked a world of feelings, a tender romance poised to unfold, a dramatic emotional journey that neither of them had anticipated but both were ready, perhaps unknowingly, to embrace. And in that quiet, emotionally charged room, surrounded by the soft glow of lamps and the lingering scent of tea, promise lingered in the air, delicate, fragile, and beautiful, a quiet question of what might come next, a gentle hook pulling them both towards something unforgettable. The night had grown deeper, the city outside Elena's window quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car, and the apartment felt warm and alive with a tension that was almost electric, a mix of anticipation, longing, and quiet excitement as she and Adrian lingered together, neither quite ready to break the fragile intimacy that had developed between them over the evening. And Elena noticed the way his presence filled the room in ways that had nothing to do with physical space, how the calm steadiness of his eyes, the subtle tilt of his head, and the gentle curve of his smile seemed to anchor her heart even as it raced, and she felt a strange thrill knowing that someone who had once been a fleeting part of her past was now standing at the threshold of her life in a way that felt deliberate, meaningful, and yet delightfully uncertain, as if the universe had conspired to give them this rare moment, this chance to reconnect, to rediscover, to awaken feelings that neither had dared speak aloud for years. And as Adrian shifted slightly closer to her on the couch, their knees almost brushing, Elena felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts racing with memories of summer afternoons, shared laughter, innocent conversations, and fleeting glances that had once seemed trivial but now, in the quiet intimacy of the living room, felt like the opening notes of a song neither had realized they had been waiting to hear, and the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words, with emotions too delicate to rush, yet too potent to ignore, as they shared stories of recent days, small triumphs, tiny frustrations, moments of loneliness, and surprising joys, finding in each other a listener, a companion, a mirror to their own hearts. And every laugh, every shared secret, every gentle glance made Elena feel more connected, more seen, more alive than she had in months, perhaps even years. And Adrian seemed equally captivated, his voice softer, richer, more attentive, his gestures careful yet expressive, and she noticed the subtle ways he mirrored her movements, the way he leaned in when she spoke, the way his hands rested gently on the couch between them as if testing the boundaries of closeness without overstepping. And she realized that this was no ordinary reunion, no casual conversation, but a delicate dance of hearts, emotions, and possibilities, a moment in which the past and present intertwined in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, exhilarating and tender. And Elena felt a shiver run down her spine as she imagined what might happen next. What could grow from this small spark into something enduring, something romantic, something that might fill the quiet corners of their lives with warmth and intimacy. And the thought made her heart ache with a mixture of hope and fear, because the connection was fragile, delicate, yet undeniable, and she could see it reflected in Adrian's eyes. In the subtle hesitation, the gentle smiles, the way his gaze lingered, the way he seemed to search for permission to bridge the invisible gap between them, the way he seemed to measure every word, every movement with care, as if aware that this moment, this night, this closeness might be a turning point, a soft awakening of hearts that had long been dormant but not forgotten. Time seemed to stretch and fold around them, minutes blending into hours as they continued to talk, sharing confessions, desires, small fears, dreams, and memories, each sentence carrying weight, each pause pregnant with unspoken meaning. And Elena felt herself drawn closer, emotionally and mentally, to a man who had once been a simple presence in her life and was now becoming a profound one, a catalyst for feelings she had tried to keep hidden but could no longer deny. And as she laughed at a shared joke, feeling the warmth of his presence so close to her, She noticed the subtle quiver of his lips, the glimmer of emotion in his eyes, the way his fingers brushed absent-mindedly against the edge of the table, and she understood that he too was navigating the same delicate tension, the same mix of excitement and vulnerability, longing and caution, that she had been feeling all evening, a mirrored emotional rhythm that made her heart ache with recognition and possibility, and in that recognition she felt a surge of hope, a thrill that this encounter could be more than fleeting, that it could be a beginning, a step toward a connection neither of them had expected but both secretly hoped for. And as Adrian shifted slightly, leaning against the doorframe with one hand, his gaze meeting hers in a way that spoke louder than words, Elena felt her chest tighten, a wave of emotion washing over her, because she realized that in the quiet, unassuming way that love and attraction often begin, something profound was unfolding, delicate yet undeniable, a soft romance wrapped in laughter, shared memories, and the tender ache of rediscovery, and she could feel herself letting down walls she hadn't realized she still carried, allowing herself to hope, to dream, to imagine a future that included this man who had been a fleeting part of her past and was now claiming a quiet, steady place in her present, and the air seemed charged with possibility, every glance, every word, every small gesture carrying meaning, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. And Elena felt a rush of courage, a desire to speak, to confess, to acknowledge the feelings that had been building between them all evening. But before she could, Adrian's hand hesitated on the door handle, a subtle pause that made her heart leap, and he turned to her with a soft, vulnerable smile. His voice low and sincere as he said, "Elena, I think I've been waiting for this moment longer than I realized." And her breath caught, a rush of warmth, excitement, and longing flooding her chest, because in that simple sentence, he had acknowledged the unspoken, the connection, the mutual attraction, and the fragile, thrilling spark that had been growing between them, and she realized that whatever came next, whether words were spoken or silences lingered, this moment would remain indelible, a turning point in the quiet rhythm of their lives, a tender beginning of something emotional, romantic, and profoundly human. And as Adrian finally stepped out the door, pausing just long enough for one last shared glance, Elena felt a rush of emotions, hope, curiosity, longing, and the soft ache of desire, filling her heart in a way she had not expected that evening. And when the door closed gently behind him, she leaned against it, her thoughts spinning with memories, possibilities, and dreams, knowing that a simple visit, a quiet conversation, and the gentle presence of a man she had once barely known had changed her night, her emotions, and perhaps the course of her life, leaving her with the lingering question of what might happen when they met again. What stories, emotions, and tender moments awaited in the chapters yet to be written, and she smiled softly, feeling a warmth that promised hope, romance, and the beauty of connection, a soft, gentle reminder that sometimes, the smallest, quietest moments can become the most meaningful, shaping hearts, lives, and futures in ways one could never anticipate.